Millionaire falls for a homeless girl, but her identity leaves him speechless. It was a night like any other for Damien Carter, a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune in real estate. The New York City skyline shimmered in the distance as he stepped out of his sleek, black Rolls-Royce, adjusting the cufflinks on his designer suit. The biting winter air sent shivers down his spine. But it wasn't the cold that made him stop in his tracks. It was her. She sat on the sidewalk, barely visible under a pile of tattered blankets, her delicate fingers sketching something on a worn piece of cardboard. Unlike most homeless people he passed on his way home, she wasn't begging, nor was she talking to anyone. Her focus was intense, her green eyes darting across the rough surface as she crafted intricate architectural details with a near-professional level of skill. Curiosity gnawed at him. Who was she? And why was someone with such talent living on the streets? As he took a step closer, the faint glow of a nearby street lamp illuminated her face, high cheekbones, a soft but determined jawline, and eyes that held a depth of intelligence he didn't expect. Her long, tangled brown hair framed her face, a striking contrast to the rough, oversized coat drowning her small frame. "That's impressive," Damien finally said, his deep voice breaking the silence. The girl froze for a moment, then slowly lifted her gaze. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting second, Damien felt something unfamiliar, an unexplainable connection. But just as quickly as she had looked at him, she turned away, her expression guarded. "It's nothing," she muttered, tucking the cardboard sketch against her chest as if shielding it from the world. Damien wasn't convinced. He had seen hundreds of architects and designers in his line of work, but something about her artwork was exceptional. The angles, the depth, the precision. It was as if she knew buildings on a deeper level than someone who had simply studied them. But there was something even more unsettling. The mansion she had sketched? It looked eerily similar to one of his own properties, a home so exclusive, only a handful of people had ever seen it. For reasons Damien couldn't quite explain, he found himself unable to just walk away. There was something about her, something that pulled at a part of him he hadn't acknowledged in years. He wasn't the type to involve himself in the lives of strangers, let alone take a homeless person out to dinner. Yet here he was, standing in front of this mysterious artist, offering her something she likely hadn't had in a long time, a warm meal. "There's a diner just down the street," he said, nodding toward the bustling city avenue. "Let me buy you dinner." The girl, still clutching her sketch, eyed him skeptically. It was clear she didn't trust easily. "Why?" she asked. It was a simple question, but one that caught Damien off guard. Why was he doing this? He wasn't sure himself. "Because I want to know more about that drawing," he admitted. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the fabric of her coat as if she might change her mind. Then, with a small sigh, she nodded. Minutes later, they stepped into a warm, softly lit restaurant. An old-school 24-hour diner with red leather booths and the lingering scent of coffee and fresh pancakes. The contrast between them was jarring. Damien, dressed in a tailored suit, looked like he had stepped out of a Forbes magazine cover. The girl, still wrapped in her worn-out coat, stood awkwardly at the entrance, visibly uncomfortable with the attention they were drawing. The hostess, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, hesitated before speaking. She was clearly trying to make sense of the situation. "Table for two?" she asked, glancing between them. "Yes," Damien said smoothly, ignoring the curious stares from other diners. He led the girl toward a secluded booth in the corner, where she slid into the seat opposite him, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't touch the menu. Instead, she stared at the table as if she were afraid this was all some kind of trick. "What's your name?" Damien asked. She hesitated again before finally answering. "Eve," she said simply. "No last name?" he pressed. She shook her head, her gaze never meeting his. "Not one I care to remember." Damien leaned back in his seat, studying her. There was an air of refinement about her, something that didn't match her current situation. The way she spoke, her choice of words, her posture, even the way she avoided unnecessary eye contact, it was all too polished. The waitress arrived, placing a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. Eve wrapped her hands around it, relishing the warmth. "So, Eve," Damien said, watching her closely, "how does someone with your kind of talent end up on the streets?" She finally met his gaze then, her green eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Some people fall," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And some of us are pushed." Damien frowned. It was a cryptic answer, but one that only made him more determined to uncover the truth. Over the next few weeks, Damien found himself drawn into Eve's world in a way he never expected. Every morning before heading to his office, he made a small detour to her usual spot, a quiet alley near a cafe, where she sat sketching on scraps of cardboard. At first she was wary, keeping her answers brief whenever he asked about her art, her past, or how she ended up on the streets. But little by little she started to let her guard down. It wasn't just her drawings that fascinated him. It was the way she spoke about architecture, business, and finance, subjects that most people in her situation wouldn't even think about. Eve had a way of analyzing things with a sharp, almost calculating mind, and her insights into real estate investments were shockingly accurate. That new high-rise on Fifth Avenue? She mentioned one afternoon as she sipped the coffee he brought her. "It's going to collapse financially within 3 years." Damien raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" Eve scoffed, tucking a strand of her tangled brown hair behind her ear. "They overestimated market demand. Too many luxury apartments, not enough buyers. High vacancy rates will drive investors away. The whole project is a ticking time bomb." Damien stared at her, stunned. She was right. He had access to inside information that confirmed exactly what she had. Just predicted, but how did she know? "You seem to know a lot about real estate," he said carefully, watching for her reaction. Eve's fingers tensed around her coffee cup, her jaw tightening slightly. "I used to live in a house like yours," she said absently, almost like she had forgotten who she was speaking to. The words hit Damien like a freight train. He straightened, feeling a sudden unease creep into his chest. "What do you mean, like mine?" he asked. Eve blinked, as if suddenly realizing what she had said. She shook her head quickly. "Nothing. Forget it." But Damien couldn't forget it. There was something off about her story, something she wasn't telling him. How could a homeless woman know so much about billion-dollar real estate deals? And more importantly, why did she recognize his house? Damien couldn't shake the feeling that Eve was hiding something big. Her knowledge of real estate? Her uncanny ability to predict market trends? And the way she carried herself, it all pointed to a past that didn't match her current reality. She wasn't just another person who had fallen on hard times. She was someone who had come from privilege, from wealth, someone who had lost it all. Determined to get answers, he tried asking her again about her past. "Why do you care so much?" she snapped one evening, the sharpness in her voice catching him off guard. They were sitting on a bench near a dimly lit park, the city buzzing around them. Yet it felt as if they were in their own little world. Damien exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. He wasn't even sure why he cared. Maybe it was because she was the first person in a long time who challenged him, who didn't care about his wealth, who saw the world differently than anyone in his social circle. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he saw something in her that reminded him of himself. A fighter. A survivor. "Because I don't think you belong on the streets," he said finally. Eve let out a short, bitter laugh. "You have no idea where I belong." Her words were laced with pain, and for the first time, Damien saw something deeper in her eyes. A sadness so profound, it was almost suffocating. She wasn't just someone who had been dealt a bad hand in life. She had been hurt, betrayed, abandoned. "Then tell me," he pushed, leaning forward. "Tell me where you belong, Eve." She turned away, staring at the distant skyline. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, barely above a whisper, she murmured, "I used to have everything. And then one day I woke up with nothing." A cold shiver ran down Damien's spine. He knew now, without a doubt, this woman wasn't just anyone. She had a story that could shake his entire world, and he was going to find out exactly what it was. Damien wasn't the type to let mysteries linger, especially not one as intriguing as Eve. The more time he spent with her, the more certain he became that she wasn't who she claimed to be. No ordinary homeless person could analyze financial markets like a Wall Street insider or speak about architecture like a seasoned developer. She wasn't just someone who had fallen on hard times. She had once belonged to a world like his, and that left him with only one option. He called in a favor from a private investigator, someone he had used before when vetting high-stakes business partners. If Eve wasn't going to tell him the truth, he was going to find it himself. Days passed, and Damien found himself more anxious than he expected. Why did he care so much? He had met countless people in his life, some rich, some poor, but none had unsettled him the way Eve did. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down he knew that was a lie. Then the report came in, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Eve wasn't just some street artist. She wasn't just a woman who had been pushed into homelessness. She was Evelyn Sinclair, the daughter of Richard Sinclair, a billionaire real estate mogul. 5 years ago, her family had vanished overnight. The tabloids had been flooded with stories about her father's sudden downfall. But then, just as quickly, the Sinclair name disappeared from the headlines. No one knew where they had gone. Until now, Damien's hands tightened around the report. He had spent years building his empire, working alongside men like Richard Sinclair, legends in the real estate world. But no one ever spoke of the scandal in detail. All that remained were whispers, rumors that Sinclair had been betrayed by his own business partners, framed for crimes he never committed, and stripped of everything he owned. And now his daughter was sitting on a sidewalk, sketching mansions on scraps of cardboard. Damien's chest tightened. How had this happened to her? How had someone born into unimaginable wealth ended up with nothing? One thing was certain, Eve had secrets. And now Damien wasn't just curious. He was determined to uncover the truth. Damien couldn't keep this information to himself. Eve had been living a lie, hiding, from a past that was far more complicated than he had imagined. The more he read through the investigator's report, the more his mind raced with questions. Why had she never told him? Why was she living on the streets when she had once been a part of the same elite world he belonged to? Had she lost everything? Or was she running from something? That evening he confronted her. Eve was sitting on a bench in a quiet part of the city, staring out at the skyline, lost in thought. She looked so small, so fragile. Yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she held herself. Damien knew that whatever had happened to her, it hadn't broken her completely. She was still fighting. She just didn't know it yet. He sat down beside her, unfolding the report and placing it between them. "So," he said, his voice carefully measured, "Evelyn Sinclair." She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the papers. She just exhaled slowly, like she had been waiting for this moment. "So you found out." Her voice was eerily calm. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his brows knitting together. "I could have helped you." Eve let out a hollow laugh, finally turning to face him. There was no anger in her eyes, only exhaustion. "Because people like you don't help people like me," she said. "You see a homeless girl and you either feel pity or disgust. And if you find out she used to be rich, then it's worse. You see a failure." Her words cut deeper than Damien expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but he couldn't, because she wasn't. "Tell me what happened," he urged. "The real story. No more running." She hesitated, but for the first time since they met, she let her walls crumble. "My father trusted the wrong people," she said quietly. His business partners, the men he had built an empire with, turned on him. They framed him for fraud, stole everything he had, and when he tried to fight back, they threatened us. My mother, she couldn't handle it. She left, and my father, he disappeared. Damien's stomach clenched. He had heard whispers of corruption in the industry, but he never imagined the extent of the betrayal. "I tried to prove his innocence," Eve continued, her voice raw with emotion. "I dug through files, I confronted the men who did this, but they made sure no one would listen. They buried every piece of evidence, erased every trace of my family's name. And when I got too close," she swallowed hard, looking away, "they made sure I disappeared too." A heavy silence settled between them. Damien had always believed that wealth granted power, that money could protect people from the harshest realities of life. But Eve's story proved him wrong. "So you've been living on the streets ever since?" he asked. She nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench. "I had nowhere else to go. No money, no friends I could trust. I went from penthouses to park benches overnight. And once you're down here, Damien, the world stops seeing you as a person. You become invisible." Damien clenched his jaw. Invisible. The thought made his chest tighten. She had been thrown away by a world that had once worshipped her. But sitting here, looking at the fire still burning in her eyes, he realized something. She wasn't broken. She was still fighting. And for the first time in years, so was he. After hearing Eve's story, Damien couldn't shake the anger simmering inside him. She had been robbed of her family, her fortune, her entire identity. And yet, she sat there, her fingers absently sketching on the edge of the bench, as if none of it mattered anymore. But it did matter. Damien had built his empire on strategy, on recognizing untapped potential. And right now, sitting in front of him, was the greatest mind he had ever encountered, wasting away on the streets. He couldn't let that happen. "Come work for me," he said suddenly. Eve stopped mid-sketch, her head snapping up. For the first time, she looked genuinely stunned. "What?" she asked, blinking as if she had misheard him. "Come work for me," Damien repeated. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto hers. "You have a gift, Eve. Your business instincts, your knowledge of real estate, hell. You knew that Fifth Avenue development was going to fail before I did. You don't belong out here." She shook her head, a bitter smile forming on her lips. "Damien, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not some charity case. You don't have to save me." "This isn't charity," he cut in, his tone firm. "This is business." Eve frowned, skepticism flickering across her face. "You think I'd offer just anyone a job at my company? I don't make decisions based on pity. I make them based on results. And I know talent when I see it." Eve let out a breath, staring at him like she was trying to read between the lines. "And what exactly would I be doing?" "Consulting," Damien said without hesitation. "For now. You have an eye for business that most executives would kill for. I want you in my company, analyzing investments, market trends, doing what you do best. You have more knowledge in your pinky finger than half of the suits in my boardroom." She exhaled, running a hand through her tangled hair. "Damien, I haven't been in an office in years. I don't even have clothes for a job like that, let alone—" "We'll take care of it," he interrupted. She looked at him uncertain. "You said the world stopped seeing you, right?" he asked, his voice softer now. "I see you, Eve, and I know exactly what you're capable of. The question is, do you—" A flicker of something, hope, maybe, lit up in her emerald eyes. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she closed it. She swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists in her lap. For the first time in years, someone was offering her more than just food or a place to sleep. Someone was offering her a chance. After what felt like an eternity, Eve finally spoke. "You're really serious about this?" "Dead serious." She let out a small, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. "You're insane, Damien Carter." "That's what they tell me," he smirked. "So, what's it going to be?" A long pause. Then at last she nodded. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." And just like that, everything changed. The moment Eve agreed to work for him, Damien set everything in motion. She had no idea what she had just signed up for, but he did. The very next morning, a black town car pulled up to the alley where she had spent the last few months. Eve had expected Damien to give her time, maybe a few days, to process everything. She was wrong. The moment she stepped inside, she was greeted by a professional stylist, a personal shopper, and an assistant, all waiting for her next move. "What is all this?" she asked, looking at Damien suspiciously as he slid into the seat beside her. "Your first day," he said simply. "You want to walk into my office, you need to look the part. First impressions matter." Eve felt a twinge of unease. She wasn't used to this anymore, to luxury, to people fussing over her like she was important. But the truth was, a small part of her missed it. She had spent years being invisible, blending into the background, surviving. Now, she was being given a second chance, and whether she liked it or not, she wasn't going to waste it. They stopped at an exclusive boutique in Manhattan, where racks of designer suits, tailored dresses, and high-end heels lined the walls. Eve hesitated at the door. "I don't need all this," she muttered. "You do if you want them to take you seriously," Damien countered. "You think the people in my boardroom will listen to someone who looks like they just walked off the street?" Eve clenched her jaw, knowing he was right. This wasn't about vanity. This was about power. In the world she was about to step back into, appearances meant everything. So she let them work. Hours later, when she finally stood in front of the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman staring back wasn't the broken, lost girl from the streets anymore. She was poised, polished, a force to be reckoned with. "You clean up well," Damien said from behind her, a smirk tugging at his lips. She turned, meeting his gaze. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't in years: confidence. "Let's see if I remember how to do this," she murmured. That afternoon, she walked into Carter Enterprises for the first time. Her head held high. And from the moment she stepped into that boardroom, everything changed. Eve's arrival at Carter Enterprises sent shockwaves through the company. Nobody knew who she was, where she had come from, or why Damien Carter had suddenly placed so much trust in her. In an industry where power was everything, whispers spread like wildfire. Some called her his new mystery advisor. Others thought she was a charity case. But Eve didn't care. She had spent years being dismissed, overlooked, and treated like she didn't exist. Not anymore. The first few weeks were grueling. She had to relearn everything: market shifts, corporate strategies, the latest industry trends. But beneath all the dust and ruin of her past, her sharp instincts had never faded. She absorbed information at lightning speed, outperforming some of Damien's top executives in market predictions and financial strategy. Then came the real test. One afternoon, an emergency meeting was called regarding a failing real estate project, one of Carter Enterprises' largest investments, which was on the brink of collapse. Investors were panicking, executives were scrambling, and the tension in the boardroom was suffocating. As the heated discussions went in circles, Eve sat silently, listening, calculating. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. "You're all looking at the wrong numbers," she said. The room fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, some confused, some skeptical, some openly dismissive. "Excuse me?" One of the senior executives sneered. Eve didn't back down. She leaned forward, her confidence unwavering. "You're too focused on the projected profit margins and missing the fact that your buyer demographic has changed," she explained. "Your target audience isn't the ultra-rich anymore. The luxury market is slowing down, but mid-range properties are thriving. If you convert a portion of the development into high-end rentals instead of high-priced condos, you'll stabilize the cash flow and avoid bankruptcy." Silence. Damien was the first to react. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a small smirk. He already knew she was right. The executives exchanged hesitant glances until finally, one of them pulled up recent market analytics. And just like that, the numbers proved her right. Within days, the company restructured its investment strategy, preventing a massive financial disaster. Damien watched as the very people who had doubted her now hung on to her every word. But then, something happened that neither of them expected. One morning, a news article surfaced. The men who had betrayed her father, the corrupt business partners who framed him and stole everything, had just been exposed in a massive fraud investigation. Their downfall was swift and brutal, years of hidden crimes unraveled overnight. Suddenly, the Sinclair name was back in the news. And Eve? She was being offered back her family's entire fortune. The life she had lost was now within reach again. But instead of celebrating, she shocked everyone, including Damien. "I don't want it," she said, her voice steady. He stared at her, stunned. "Eve, this is your legacy." She shook her head. "No, Damien. My past is my past. My legacy is what I build for myself." For the first time in his life, Damien Carter, the ruthless businessman, the man who believed power was everything, was speechless. Because the woman in front of him had more power than money could ever buy. She had rebuilt herself from nothing. And she was never going back. For most people, the choice would have been easy: accept the fortune, reclaim the Sinclair empire, and return to the life she had lost. But Eve wasn't most people. She had lived in a world of power before, and she had seen firsthand how fragile it was, how quickly trust could be broken, how easily everything could be ripped away. The money didn't matter to her anymore. What mattered was the person she had become. And Damien? He had spent his entire life believing that wealth was the ultimate measure of success. He had fought tooth and nail to build his empire, sacrificing friendships, relationships, anything that got in the way of his ambition. But standing here, In front of Eve, this woman who had lost everything and still risen from the ashes. He realized something he never had before. She was richer than he had ever been. Not in money, but in resilience, in strength, in the unshakable belief that she was more than just a name, more than just a legacy. "You really don't want it?" he asked one last time, still trying to process what she was saying. She smiled, not the small guarded smiles she used to give him, but a real one, a smile of freedom. "No," she said simply, "because I already have everything I need." For the first time in his life, Damien Carter felt what it was like to lose control, because suddenly, the woman in front of him, the one who had nothing, meant more to him than all the wealth in the world. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then, before he could think twice, before he could weigh the risks like he always did, Damien stepped forward and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of desperation, of need, or of possession. It was a kiss of recognition, because he finally understood he hadn't saved Eve. She had saved him. And for the first time, Damien Carter, the billionaire, who had everything, finally had something that money could never buy: love. Together, they built a new empire, not one built on old names or inherited wealth, but one built on trust, ambition, and second chances. Eve Sinclair had been forgotten by the world, but she had returned, not as a billionaire's daughter, but as the woman who rewrote her own destiny. And Damien? He had thought he was offering her a second chance, but in the end, she was the one who gave it to him. What a journey! From the cold streets to the top of the business world, Eve didn't just get a second chance. She proved that real power comes from within. What would you have done in her situation? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more incredible stories like this. See you in the next one.